Pause the video and think about how you would answer these questions. The external history of various languages testifies to numerous attempts to predict their future. Time has shown, these predictions turned out to be both correct and incorrect. Nowadays, the English language confidently claims the status of the leading world language. And during the 16-17 centuries, the English themselves perceived it as a rural, backward, imperfect, and therefore hopeless. It seemed to them that soon it would disappear without a trace, giving way to universal, highly developed Latin. The American linguist and lexicographer Noah Webster warned in 1789 that in the future the language of North America will be as different from that of Great Britain as the modern Dutch, Danish, and Swedish languages are from German or from each other. In 1877, this prediction was repeated by the founder of the English Phonetic School, Henry Sweet. Both scientists correctly indicated the direction of changes, but their predictions generally did not come true. British, American, and Australian varieties of English still remain mutually intelligible. Moreover, given the current scope of global communications, American English has a strong influence on all other varieties of the English language, so it is possible that in the future they will converge. In the early 1940s, a Rockefeller-sponsored symposium was held at the University of Wisconsin to discuss the fate of America's minority languages. Based on their research, the linguists present came to the conclusion that most of these languages, including French, will not survive until the end of the 20th century. Today, the position of the French language in Quebec is higher than at the time of forecasting. The same prediction was made a century earlier in the 1840s by a British colonial administrator who had witnessed the disintegration of Napoleon's empire. Moreover, 4 centuries earlier, some English scholars concluded that if people had a better education, in Latin and French, there would be no need to learn English at all. Current views on the future of the English language predict its final consolidation as the main language of communication between the peoples of the world. It is impossible to verify the feasibility of this forecast. However, as the history of mankind shows, the role of a means of international communication in different regions has shifted from one language to another over time, depending on the political, economic, and cultural success of their speakers. Ancient Chinese, Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, Ancient Greek, Latin, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, all these languages at one time had the status of languages of world importance. Some languages partially preserve it until now, others have lost it irrevocably, others have lost not only this status, but also their existence. The status of the world language is changeable and unstable. There is no solid evidence that English will retain it forever. In this regard, it is appropriate to cite the forecasts that were given for the future of the Russian language in the middle of the 20th century. Today, except for a smile, they do not cause anything. For example, the writer Tolstoy called in 1934, "The Russian language must become a world language. The time will come, and it is not far off, the Russian language will be studied on all the meridians of the globe." This kind of prediction was evidenced by claims to linguistic and cultural missionary work, a kind of world historical role. Finally, we can recall Khrushchev's prediction, which he made in Minsk in January 1959, not understanding the speech in Belarusian, "The sooner we all speak Russian, the sooner we will build communism." We witnessed the collapse of the idea of communism, and the disintegration of the socialist camp. The dreams of the world role of the Russian language have also vanished, although it still maintains its position in some countries of the former USSR. Much more often the predictions turned out to be wrong, not about the worldwide spread, but about the near death of those languages that were in an unfavorable situation and were subjected to intensified linguicide. In the middle of the 19th century, Engels confidently predicted the disappearance of small Slavic peoples and their languages. He included only Russians and Poles as viable Slavs, and categorically denied the future to other Slavs, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Slovenes. They were said to have fallen under foreign rule at the lowest stage of civilization, and therefore did not develop the ability to develop independently. Engels predicted the Czechs' Germanization. Such chauvinistic predictions did not cause surprise, because the forcible Germanization of the Czechs continued in full swing. The tragic consequences of assimilation were fully manifested even earlier, in the second half of the 18th century. The Czech literary language suffered from the limitation of social functions, the narrowing of the social base, the instability and non-codification of norms. As a result, it turned out to be unable to satisfy all the communicative needs of its users. At the end of the 18th century, it was almost completely pushed out of state political and cultural life. Since 1774, it has not been taught in schools. German was spoken in the cities, and Czech could only be heard in remote villages. Despite this, the national revival confused all the predictors' cards. With the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, 1918, they formed their own state, thus proving their national vitality. From the end of the 13th century, the Finnish people were under rule of the Swedish crown, and the Finnish language had no opportunities for full development. Assimilation especially intensified from the middle of the 17th century. The Swedish language was established as the official language, it was taught in schools and universities, the entire social elite was Swedish-speaking. The Finnish language remained mainly in the village, except for religious services. In the 18th century, the Swedish administration and Swedish science stated the futility of the Finnish language and predicted its rapid disappearance. Starting from the 1860s, thanks to the national movement, the Finnish language gradually gained prestige and confidently pushed Swedish out of all spheres of public life. At the beginning of the 20th century, Finnish was already the language of the majority. Gloomy predictions about its doom did not come true. The linguistic history of mankind knows examples when optimistic predictions did not come true too. This happens when the language suddenly dies as a result of force majeure, war, genocide, natural disasters. Yes, at one time, hardly anyone could predict the rapid, unexpected decline of Yiddish, the language of the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe. At the beginning of the 20th century, Yiddish was spoken by 11 to 12 million Jews, out of a total of 17 million. The central area is Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Slovakia, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania. Yiddish really flourished in the period between the two world wars. It turned from a small-town colloquial language into a developed, multifunctional language, dominating all spheres of Jewish life, except for the religious one. It was traditionally served by Hebrew. The tragic breakdown occurred during the Second World War. Of the 6 million Jews exterminated during the Holocaust, about 85% were Yiddish speakers. During the post-war decades in the USSR and other European countries, Jews underwent rapid assimilation, switching to the languages of the peoples among whom they lived. As a result, the use of Yiddish decreased dramatically. In fact, the language has completely lost its range and now has a limited circle of elderly speakers scattered in different countries. In less than a century, the demographic power of Yiddish has decreased 22 to 24 times. The result was completely unpredictable. The fate of another Jewish language, Hebrew, turned out to be just as unpredictable. If throughout the 20th century Yiddish catastrophically declined, during this time Hebrew unexpectedly overcame the opposite path, from a half-dead book language to a completely alive language. So far in history, the revival of dead languages has never happened, and therefore it was considered incredible. The successful revival of Hebrew became an example of purposeful, large-scale influence on the language with its restoration in the entire range of communicative functions. Who would have believed that a language could be brought back to life, and even in such a short period of time? The revival of Hebrew is an unprecedented linguistic phenomenon. It is clear that to predict something similar at the end of the 19th century was absolutely impossible. Today, however, this success gives hope to those who seek to revive their ethnic languages. The history of Ukrainian is abundantly littered with gloomy predictions about the lack of prospects, quick oblivion, and final obsolescence. These predictions came not only from the mouths of foreigners, colonizers, assimilators, but also from native speakers themselves. Ideas about the hopeless nature of the Ukrainian language, predictions about its final decline actually existed until the end of the 20th century. Life has shown their fallacy. The Ukrainian language has passed the test and entered a new stage of its development. Unfulfilled predictions can teach a lesson of linguistics in general. We cannot predict. We know the language exclusively in its present and past states, but we do not consider the future of the language as an object of knowledge at all. We believe that this problem is not scholarly, and prediction is not the task of scholars at all. However, this view is mistaken. The purpose of science is not limited to the search for truth. It has another, no less important function: prognostic. Rational knowledge of the future is quite possible, although it will have its own specifics. The result will be knowledge not actual, but hypothetical. As for language prediction, it is actually in its infancy state. If we consider these past predictions, we can ask the question, will the current predictions be better than them? Of course, they can be wrong about many things for various reasons. The future of a language depends on the number of people who speak it. This number is usually based on population surveys that include one or more questions about language. Some countries either do not conduct the survey or do not include questions about language, which is due to economic or political factors. So, for example, in Belgium in 1962, a law was passed that prohibited the inclusion of a language question in a national survey. The form, meaning and content of the question about language, which is included in the national survey, is different in different countries. For example, a country may classify its population according to ethnicity, identity, mother or father language, language spoken at home, usual language or first language. It is not the same thing. The common language of millions of people in the world is not their first language, but the one they learned, a regional, national or colonial language. Most of the statistical data obtained during surveys are determined by the formula one person, one language and are based on the person's primary language, which is determined by the survey criteria. Even when there is more than one language issue, as in Canada or India, people are still classified by their language. This factor may have little effect on the language of a small monoethnic country. However, when assessing spoken languages, these discrepancies can cause significant differences, because the common language of millions of people in many countries is not the language they learned at home, the language spoken by their parents, or the language associated with their ethnicity. Consider a recent prediction about the future of French. Based on one person, one language projections, it can be argued that the number of French speakers in the middle of the 21st century will remain within 70 million. This projection does not take into account the fact that the number of non-native speakers of French exceeds the number of the native population. French is one of the few international languages for which this statement is true. This means that when we take into account non-native speakers, the number could be closer to 200 million. Many of these countries are third-world countries, where life expectancy continues to rise and, despite the projected decline in birth rates, the total population is increasing faster than in rich countries. This means that over the next 50 years, Africa's population will triple to 2 billion people, while Europe's population will shrink by 12% to about 640 million people. The role of these non-native users in the process of language diffusion is as important as that of native speakers. Many of them are leaders in the fields of education, commerce, science, and literature. This is confirmed by the laureates of many scientific and literary awards. In fact, more and more authors are writing literary works in their second or third language. Language is no longer the property of a separate nation and state, it can be used by citizens of any country. For example, German author Bertelsmann currently publishes the largest number of books in English. Sellers prefer those languages that the largest part of potential buyers understand. Scientists, writers, and artists want to publish their work in a language that is accessible to as many potential customers as possible. In the distant past, a language was the property of its users. With the formation of national states, it began to be associated with the country where it is spoken. It was as if the language belonged to the state. As a result of the increase in population mobility and the disintegration of states, this idea has changed. A language belongs to the people who speak it. In many parts of the world, migrants are concentrated in large cities, where they form their own linguistic minority and communicate in their native language with their fellow speakers. They may even have their own schools, media, and services. Some minorities are so densely populated that they can even be considered a city within a city. The second largest Mexican, Cuban, and Puerto Rican cities can be found in Los Angeles, Miami, and New York. However, these Spanish-speaking societies are not included in surveys conducted in Mexico, Cuba, or Puerto Rico. Extrapolation is widely practiced in the sciences. It has also been used to predict the future of languages. This can lead to incorrect predictions because these different phenomena are incompatible. In the physical sciences, the accuracy of extrapolation is limited only by means of observation and interpretation. An observed physical phenomenon cannot of itself change a trend or start a new one. People can and do change trends, their behavior is less predictable. The growing role of English has a significant impact on projections. By the middle of the 20th century, English was the language of half of the world's magazines and newspapers, 3/4 of all correspondence, and 3/5 of all radio stations. The trend has continued ever since, reflected in movies, songs, computer software, and the Internet. Is the continuation of this trend inevitable? If the cause-effect scheme is followed in the modeling of the future of languages, then it is clear that an increase in the number of functions of a language, for example, increases its status, determines or stabilizes its place in society. In such a model, many factors are involved that cause the movement towards the expansion of the language, among them, geographical, social, political, and psychological, affecting the increase of territoriality, immigration, acculturation, urbanization, lifestyle, endogamy, economic prosperity, or self-esteem. However, there is also such a factor as falling downwards in the direction of gradual extinction, when a language gradually loses its social functions due to emigration, famine, disease, genocide, declining birth rates, exogamy, unemployment, insufficient education, poverty, or language ban. According to forecasts, this will be the fate of half of the world's languages in the 21st century. However, probably not, because most of the world's languages lie between these extremes. The presence of one positive force can compensate for the absence of another. These factors shape the environment where language functions as code and behavior. If language as a code is a system of systems, then language as behavior is a multifaceted and multifunctional system of mutually modifying practices. However, it is affected by changes in the environment, which can be caused by the unpredictable behavior of people and supplemented by the horrors of history. The fate of language as a code was presented in the form of an interaction of choice and chance. There are also factors that determine the fate of language as behavior. Because of the probability factor, ecological models can reflect the past and present of a language, but not its future. Pause the video and think about how you would answer these questions.